Hello and welcome to Skeleton Songs.
I've got 2 titles to suggest.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I haven't run them past you yet, so let's run them past you now. So one of these will mean something to listeners of a certain age, and one of it will mean something to almost nobody ever. The one that will
That sounds like the one for us.
The one that will mean something to almost nobody ever is the devil's testicles.
Oh, Alexis.
Yeah, it's relevant.
What are we?
It's culture.
We're less than 30 seconds in and we said the word testicles.
I'm sorry, 50% of the human race, 49.8, because some of us have accidents and leave them on the hood ornaments of cars. And the second one is, I don't want to be Elfstar anymore, I want to be Debbie.
Yes, none of that mean anything to me at all.
Right. So again, about 11 people around the world listening to that, when they hear, I don't want to be Elfstar anymore, I want to be Debbie, will be clutching their heads and going, oh my God, Jack Chick.
And for the other, 8 billion people who aren't those 11 people, this episode is about D&D and tabletop gaming and how it has evolved into the modern video game world that we know and sometimes love today.
It has, and I think so this riffs off an article I wrote for Eurogamer. In fact, my first column for Eurogamer, called "How It Happened to Happen." I just remembered not to
wrote quite a lot about fish genitalia.
I did write some about.
You
okay,
did?
So again, everyone has them. Everyone comes from them.
Everyone has fish genitalia.
Everyone has some sort of. I mean, again, not everyone. 99.8. But
my father was allegedly born with gills, which apparently is more common than you think.
Where?
On his neck.
Oh, good heavens! Really? In Innsmouth?
No, my family do not come from Innsmouth, contrary to popular...
I mean, you wouldn't say if they did, would you?
I'm just saying that's why you don't come home for Christmas, okay? For your own good. No, apparently it's quite common because in the womb, I think we all form gills initially or something to help us breathe before we've got the umbilical sorted. I mean, you're clearly somebody who's never had a baby, as you can tell.
I mean, I didn't grow gills in the womb, so I'm not a mutant.
But you did, and apparently mostly by the time the kid is born... the gills have gone away and we have what looks like a human neck, but in some kids it just doesn't, and it goes away after a bit once they're out. He hasn't got gills anymore, okay?
There are 3 ages of D&D.
Right.
And these are the 3 ages seen from my perspective. So I want you to cast your mind back through the hurtling sandstorms of the Vales of Time.
Right.
To the year 1980.
Right. Before I was born.
Before you were born, and when I was only 8 years old.
So small.
So small. And I was a introverted nerd who was thankfully off swimming because I had an ear infection or something horrible. And I was sitting in Temple County swimming pool in Oxford, a grim place in those days. I remember the nettles pressing against the glass windows in the grey gloom of the English summer. Oh. And I became aware that there was 2 kids sitting in front of me who had a book with a dragon on the cover. And they were talking about hit points. And I didn't know what hit points were, but basically I knew I wanted some. It took me a long time to understand that the hit points were things that went down, rather than if you had more hit points, that meant you could be hit in more places. But they had one of the very early editions of D&D. I spent way too much time before the show trying to work out exactly which one of the 3 possible candidates it was, and I don't know, and it doesn't matter. But one of them was sort of walking the other through whatever the introductory scenario was in the book, and I was hooked. The course of my life changed that day, and I went home and I put together a sort of little adventure based on what I'd just seen and heard. It was something I did when I was 8 that was copied, so it was obviously no good at all.
That's adorable.
And then I made my brother play it with me. And would you like to hear the first game system I ever wrote?
I would love to hear the first game system.
So it's, you go into a room with some goblins, and then you roll a dice. And if you roll 5 to 6, you win, you kill them. And if you roll 1 to 2, you lose, they kill you. And if you roll 3 to 4, it's a draw. And you'll notice some problems with that system, as I did quite quickly when my brother rolled 1 to 2 at the beginning of the adventure. So that was the first thing. It was this weird import. Some nerds in Wisconsin had invented a system based on a wargaming system. You know, this is how D&D first came about, right? That it was
Gary Gygax.
Chainmail. Well done.
Thank you very much.
So, but the point is, you had a war game that people wanted to attach stats and stories and histories and characters to the figures of. They turned that into a system, and it became an absolute insane success. and it sort of began to tip over into the mainstream. So that's the second age of D&D. That's when it first touched the mainstream. And the emblematic image for me here is of many-sided polyhedral dice showing up in E.T., the extraterrestrial, the Steven Spielberg here. Yeah. Do you remember this?
No, because when I watched E.T. I was very young, and I was kind of more focused on the whole alien thing.
Yeah.
And I didn't get the resonance of the tabletop stuff because I hadn't ever been introduced to it, so I sort of passed me by blithely. But now, having had the secondary experience of watching this referred to in Stranger Things, which obviously is a very nostalgic experience, and it came to me after I'd actually played tabletop games, then I suddenly understood, why this is featured and how much it's kind of the Toy Story for nerds, isn't it? It kind of pulls back a lot of childhood memories.
That's a really good way of putting it. And I think that the Stranger Things take on D&D is very much the sort of the second age revisited. It's that sense of it being something that you either were into or you weren't, as opposed to the first age, which is what even is this? It's a mid-American import. But by the time D&D came, by the time ET came round, they could put a bunch of teenagers in the kitchen playing D&D, and it was a sort of a slightly outre cultural reference. And again, the polyhedral dice occupy centre stage in this because they are so instantly recognisable.
Yeah, you don't use them for anything else, do you?
And it's very much the kind of evolutionary thing that interests me is how we've ended up with the dice we've ended up with. So what we've got are basically the platonic solids, the 12-sided and 20-sided, but nobody uses D4 anymore. Except as possibly caltrops to keep burglars at bay.
No, for that you want, yeah.
And the D12 is mostly a cat toy and is quite effective as that. But
our cats like them. Yeah.
But the D6 and D10 remain popular, especially because they're used lots in a bunch of extant legacy systems. D20 likewise, and because they give you nice, predictable bell curves and easy numbers and things when you roll a pair of them together. Oh, you don't get bell curve with D100. I'm being nerdy. Okay, no. The point is...
It's a podcast about D&D.
The devil's testicles.
Oh. We're not calling it that.
When we're not calling it... Well, we don't have to.
Well, Angoni does the art and all of the blood.
Yeah, fair.
So
okay.
We're not calling it that.
Hashtag censorship. Right, you roll 2d6.
Yeah.
Or 2 dice, as non-nerds call it. And you roll double 6. What's that called? Boxcars.
Snake eyes. You win
double
gambling.
Double 1 is snake eyes.
Yeah.
And is often a bad thing.
Double 6 is box cart.
Boxcars.
What?
I don't know. It's
double 6.
No, I don't.
At 12, shouldn't it be like bakery fun or like?
Bakery fun sounds way better, but
okay, right. So this is the new.
See,
we're changing the traditions in this podcast.
Well, here's a hallowed tradition for you. If you're rolling D100 in a sort of fairly standard percentile-based system, what's the best thing you can roll?
1.
What's the worst thing you can roll?
99.
No.
Well, 100.
0.
Is that the best?
The devil's testicles.
Oh, good grief! I feel manipulated.
Like no.
That's such a masculine, stupid. Because you could just as easily say, Lilith's breasts, but because it's all man, it has to be about testicles. Well, you know what, Alexis? Testicles ain't coming in my D&D. So
did Lilith have breasts? I guess she would have, wouldn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah. Although in her earliest incarnation she was a night-flying reptile owl.
Eggs. So. You didn't have to bring in testicles.
Could do that, but they are actually also... Egg is also slang for...
But also...
Because they're so fragile. Right, can we please stop talking about genitalia, Lottie? I feel this is...
You're obsessed.
This is unfitting obsession. But that's the second age. It's when you could look at a pair of polyhedral dice and it was a signifier. You either said, what are these things? Are they some sort of alien spore? Or you said, oh, D&D. And I think it's worth pointing out there's a lot of TRPGs that aren't D&D, but that obviously has the sort of 2 orders of magnitude more brand recognition than all the others that appear at the same time. If I say Traveller, people will generally go, what? If I say Call of Cthulhu, people will generally go, but D&D is the big daddy. But I was watching a zombie show, Black Summer. I strongly recommend it if you like things about people running around going which I do.
Literally the entire genre.
And but at the beginning we got a family packing, and there is a girl of about my daughter's age, so sort of preteen, who's hastily scooping all us up into a bag to take with them. It's a nice moment because, you get the sense of what happens in the early days of a disaster when you haven't yet decided the only things you're taking with you are water and a knife and some antibiotics. And the kid's sort of obviously trying to decide whether to take like her trading cards with her or not. And her mother sort of comes in to hurry her up, and she sees a set of quite nice looking polyhedral dice on the carpet, and she scoops them up and puts them in her daughter's bag. And just quick close up on them, and we're obviously intended to know what they are. I'm sure not everyone watching the show would.
I think there probably is a larger overlap in audience type of the people who are watching zombie TV series and the people who enjoy nerdy pastimes.
I think there is. That's true. So it's a bit of an overclaim on my part. Is it? But still, now. So again, this is the third age, but it's got some kind of global recognition. And when we have certainly dozens, perhaps hundreds of successful professional level podcasts and streams devoted to live or recorded role-playing sessions, often but not always D&D. And this from somebody who grew up in the 70s and 80s, when, in the first age, when one did not speak this thing's name. It's boggling and largely delightful. And I want to get something out of the way right now, which is, this isn't going to be one of these nostalgia things where I bemoan the fact that nerd culture used to be for the true otaku or any of that. Because I was around in the 70s, 80s, and it was shit. If you were interested in any of this stuff, there was basically one shop in Oxford. Lovely shop, the Gameskeeper, the couple who ran it. One died, the other retired, but wonderful institution. And it still exists under new management. The one shop you go to, and then occasionally you can find like a Traveller rule book or a D&D rule book in some other shop that sort of didn't know what they were, but has obviously ticked them in a catalogue somewhere. If you wanted to play D&D or Traveller or Call of Cthulhu or Tales from the Floating Vagabond or Ars Magic or anything else, you basically had to decide how annoying a level of friend you're prepared to put up with, because the overlap between people who were going to play RPGs, people you actually wanted to be in a room with, was sometimes limited. So that was it was rubbish. No internet. You couldn't find out about this stuff.
That must have been part of the draw, though, that it was this sort of really scarce resource. And I surmise that a number of nerds who might not feel super confident in their social status in the rest of the world might enjoy knowing a lot about a subject that they had access to and cared about that other people didn't.
It was, and it's true.
So that must have been part of the fun.
There's always a silver lining, and it was. But this is what people think about now when they think about.
I see, but they don't think about how actually frustrating it is not to be able to. So
you do, but also, I'm sure you've been in a room with people competitively quoting Monty Python or Terry Pratchett.
Yeah.
And often it had that sort of feeling of let's all go in as hard as we can on the in-joke.
Well, so that I think is interesting because it's interesting to see your three ages of this stuff, and I think I came in a kind of at the second age, because it's not that. So my friends aren't nerds. Right, most of my friends are really not nerds. Several of them don't have any social media of any kind. Several of them are basically Luddites, and a couple of them sort of enjoy playing video games and playing TRPGs, but they really are not the kind of people you'd expect to be into nerd stuff, right? So when I was introduced to tabletop role-playing games, it wasn't because I had a big nerd friend who said, guys, I've got this, Traveller thing and I have to tell you about the rules and I've got this polyhedral dice. It was about social interaction. So it's interesting that you say actually the social interaction side of it from your experience at the start was often a downside because you wanted to play the system, and in order to play the system you needed you had a limited selection of people to play it with, and you had to kind of go with it. Whereas I had the opposite introduction. It was, I have a group of friends with whom I love spending time, and here's an activity which basically facilitates us spending time together. And that kind of, I think, is part of our different approach to TRPGs, that I have come in from a more traditionally rules light story based experience. So I'm a big fan of, for example, the Call of Cthulhu series, rather than D&D, which I think tends to originally I think lent more heavily into rules. And you, as a game designer, are very interested in the mechanics and the actual design.
Yes and no. So I think you're right. It is the second age, and I'll come back to one particular distinguishing feature of the second age in a minute. But the rules light thing it was a much earlier fork than that. So I think a lot of people feel about the rules in a game the way that my mother, who is a Church of England Christian, feels about theologians. It's like she's not really very interested in them,
but she's glad they're there.
She's glad they're there, exactly. So how many people have ever used the encumbrance rules from D&D? Probably about 4, and probably 2 of them are now confined to institutions. But it's nice to have them there because it gives you an idea of what kind of thing you should do, and it means somebody says, oh well, if we're carrying all this stuff, maybe we should start using the encumbrance rules, and everybody says, oh, we don't want to do that, let's drop the 10-foot pole or the stereotypical equipment. And my experience was I played a little bit of TRPG stuff, various systems through school. I then went to university, and it was very much sort of my introduction to the Second Age. And a lot of rules light stuff, a lot of homebrew stuff, and also a lot of people who really wanted to get into the nitty gritty of Shadowrun or Friday Night Firefight, which is the Cyberpunk 2020 rule system. And I have some not entirely pleasant memories of sort of 3.5-hour combats that lasted 11 seconds of game time because everybody's counting up all the dice they're going to roll and tactical advantage and all the rest of it. So I think that fork existed very early on, but I think you're right. The cleavage became more apparent later when you had to be pretty hardcore. I don't like that phrase. When you had to be pretty grognardy and enthusiastic about the rules to want to use much rules, and nearly every TRPG session I've seen or been in for the last 30 years, although I basically stopped TRPGing when I started making games because I knew otherwise I'd just end up spending all my creative energy on doing DM
But I'm slowly
DM
convincing you to come back, aren't I?
Yeah, well, well, let's talk about that at the end, the actual plug, I guess. But most of the stuff I've seen and played over the years has been rules light, and I think it's interesting seeing a lot of people be apologetic about being rules light because they often feel like they're sort of cheating or not doing it properly or something. But of course they're fucking not. Of course, ultimately what every TRPG ever, especially the ones that use miniatures of, is an outgrowth of, is Let's Pretend. It's the ones that don't use miniatures are Let's Pretend running around pretending to be people, and the ones that do use miniatures are the kind of games my brother and I used to play where we had like Lego minis or Star Wars figures and would pick them up and go, now you die, Darth Vader. Well, but with rules and in a more adult way. And I'm not, God knows I'm not, as a sort of role player of 40 years vintage, 40 years, being scornful about it. Of course I'm not, but that's what it is.
No, I think you're right that it is interesting that people, because I feel exactly the same way, that sort of the rules lighters are kind of not doing it properly, and it's kind of, the more you engage with the encumbrance rule, the more seriously we should take you as a sort of player. But I think the thing at the centre of TRPGs that often doesn't get talked about that much is the fact that it's basically an excuse to be in a room with other people. It is a fundamentally social game, which is something really unusual in video games.
It is,
of course
you're right.
You have multiplayer, of course you have, co-op and whatever, but actually a lot of gamers would identify themselves as introverts who quite like being left to their own devices to play a game, either single player or within very controllable metrics with other people who are probably in a different physical location, whereas TRPGs are almost unique. And I know that now, particularly in the pandemic and in recent years, that there is an increasing trend of people to play digitally with other people, but I certainly don't think you get the same experience.
I agree.
So I think it is...
And you don't get the social thing, I'm just going to make a cup of tea while the GM talks to this person.
It's a nice evening, right? And this is, I was going to say, one of the things that I've learned, having inexplicably done the marketing for this studio, for Cultist Simulator and for Book of Hours and for everything else that we do, is you cannot ever make something too simple for people, and that's not insulting people's intelligence, that's not saying people are morons or anything like that, but if you are, for example, trying to encourage people to partake in a sweepstake or a competition or to give you feedback, a lot of people start out with the idea that, right, well, specifically we want these people to do is X, Y, and Z, and it'd be great if they could say this and great if we could say that. But if you're on, the train on the way to work and you see something pop up that says, would you mind writing a 500-word response to how this image makes you feel, then what you're going to do is go, lol, and eat a banana. Whereas if what you say is, press this button, then lots of people press that button.
Because if you've got 2% of somebody's attention, you're lucky, and most of us... 2% of our attention is probably about the level of sentience that a sleepy lizard has.
Exactly. And, and you can convince someone to do a bit more work if you can offer them a prize that they really want or whatever it is. But realistically, if you are trying to get people's attention and you're trying to engage with them in a fun way, you want to give them as little kind of burden as possible. So basically, you can get away with press that button or enter your email address, and beyond that, you're asking quite a lot. And I think that the rules light experience is kind of that. You can say, well, either one person in this group needs to spend basically a full day reading through a list of numbers to fully understand every possible rule system that might be used in this game, and then everyone else in the group has to suddenly decide that they're going to interact through rules rather than through kind of human interaction, which is obviously what this whole thing is about. Or you can say humans going to be humans, so let's and the point is to have this fun experience together. So maybe if people say, I'm not that bothered about realistically carrying too much stuff, because I'm not saying I'm carrying an elephant home, I'm saying I'm carrying one pan and a stick, then that's more kind of in keeping with what's actually going on, which is people are interacting, right?
So this segues beautifully to my next point, which is the arc that brings us from the first age to the second age and the third age.
Make it sound Tolkien-esque. The frost giants came down.
Do I? What a coincidence! And the defining characteristic of I think of your geek or your nerd, speaking as a geek and or a nerd. I wish I could credit the person who I saw describe this, but I can't remember. It was on a long defunct blog that I saw 20 years ago. They pointed out that geeks and or nerds tend to be enthusiastic. That's the defining thing. Whether you think about otaku or you think about breathless school children in Oxford in the 1980s, it's that, let me tell you about this, it's really exciting. And a couple of things about
I've got a date with your daughter to show me her Minecraft realm this afternoon.
Oh, bless her. Yeah, we're putting it off, and I'm genuinely interested, but I know it's going to go on a bit longer than
but that's a great example.
Yeah, and that's you really want to share, and one of the deadly experiences you have as a tabletop role player is people telling you about their experiences in their TRPG sessions.
It's like hearing about someone else's dream, isn't it?
It's exactly that's literally the comparison I was going to make. We spent too much time together.
Way too much time together. Yeah.
But it's exactly that. Just like almost nobody telling you about their dream is interesting. Almost nobody telling you about their TRPG session is interesting, except to them.
Really
there are exceptions. I've known a couple of people who are very good at storytelling, and they can really make it.
Or you can get away with like one particular moment, like it was amazing because then his head exploded. But basically beyond that, you're like,
Yeah, but so enthusiasm. And the flip side of enthusiasm is, and I'm indebted to this nameless blogger long ago. It's uncool. Coolness is all about being not too enthusiastic about anything. That's why we have the word. So what you got in your stereotypical 80s Stranger Things disco is you got the nerd of the wild hair going, oh, and another thing, and let me tell you about half-orcs, because they get the stat bonuses, but also, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about...
And you've got a cool boy smoking by his motorbike going, man, whatever.
Yeah, okay, I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Everyone wants to be that guy.
Well, speaking as a lady, to gender it for a minute, which of these two guys... do you think?
I have chosen the nerd with the telling me about the half-orcs.
But you see the appeal of the bad boy in leather.
I mean, I don't think I am a good example.
No, you're not. I realise that.
I do, and I think in my personal experience is that the boy in the leather is usually very handsome, but a total wanker. And the nerd is maybe not as physically prepossessing, but has got a heart of gold. That's been my repeated experience.
Well, I'm not unsympathetic to that point of view, but
and you, of course, unite both.
Hooray! But what I was going to say is the enthusiasm means that in the first stage, when you need to get a fucking import from America, or Games Workshop printed the basic D&D in like 1978 or something, but even then there was like one Games Workshop shop in the world at that point, which is surreal to think now. And you had to be really enthusiastic to get it, and really enthusiastic to get other people to play with you, and really enthusiastic to play it. Second age, you have some idea what it is. Somebody says, hey, do you want to play D&D? You don't say, what's that? Third age, everyone knows the burden of enthusiasm is much lower. And this is often the way that nerd culture works, is that it's a bit of a sort of early breach into things that might be interesting if they're done right. And then if it's actually going to be interesting, it's picked up, becomes mainstream. And if it's not, then it dies a merciful death. And the three
I think the Star Wars Star Trek divide is an interesting example there.
Go on.
Well, because the adage goes that people are either into Star Wars or Star Trek, and never the twain shall meet. And I think we fall squarely into the Star Trek bracket.
Do we?
I mean, listeners, he is very rude about Star Wars when he's not on air. So yes, he's not a Star Wars fan.
I loved Star Wars when I was 8.
Right, that sort of comment. So we like Star Trek, but many people love Star Wars, and I think it's interesting that Star Wars, I think, has made that leap into the mainstream. I think I get people now who are not nerds at all, who aren't interested in nerd culture, but will go and see it because it's a big blockbuster film. In a way that I don't see people casually going to see Star Trek stuff. That still very much seems to sit in the nerd.
That's just an artifact of the era. I think Star Trek had its day. And they've stopped making Star Trek films now, basically, haven't they?
Yeah, but that's
and then Star Wars had its renaissance. Star Wars had a renaissance after like 20 years of somnolence. 20 years, 15 years, I don't know.
But I
think I am not convinced that Star Trek is a less mainstream institution than Star Wars.
I am. I'm totally
moved.
Yeah,
that's because you're a Trekist.
No, it's not. It's not that I'm trying to be rude about it at all. It's that repeatedly I see Star Wars being engaged with by a much larger like Marvel films, which is always the kind of go-to like nerd culture gone big thing, or Game of Thrones. I think there really is something intrinsic in those franchises which are not intrinsic in other franchises which have been extremely popular and could totally have done it. I'm not saying, Star Wars should be compared to, I don't know, the Gambit spin-off series of the X-Men comics that I read when I was 14, because obviously they're not really comparable, but I think the Star Wars Star Trek thing is comparable, and one of them has become much more mainstream than the other, and I think that's interesting.
You might be right. I'm gonna go and read up on it after the podcast. You got me interested, and I'm genuinely not sure. But what I was going to say about the three ages is the second age. You know what I didn't see in the first age at all, and I only saw once I got to university.
Dragons.
Pretty much as mythical in my childhood. Ladies.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to approach this softly, but I'm glad. Well,
but this is the segue here is from the enthusiasm thing, because until I went to university. I had
never met a lady.
I'd always never met a lady because I went to single-sex boys' schools largely. But I'd been in a room with 3 male TRPG players and 0 female TRPG players.
Yeah.
And that wasn't unusual. And it wasn't, Gary Gygax, bless him, was a man of an earlier age. I think sort of was of the opinion that maybe ladies are biologically unsuited for playing D&D. But the earlier age. But basically, as far as I understand it, if you are a lady and you like your dragons, and somebody says, we do a thing that involves dragons or amateur dramatics or whatever aspect of it appeals, and you go into a room and it is full of boys, perhaps at that stage with hygiene issues, because we're talking about sort of nerds in the 80s who are nervous because the ladies come into the room and they all sort of go quiet and stare at you all evening, then you might not go back. And if you do go back, often you turn into a monster because you realise you become queen, which a phenomenon I also saw. So that was one of the things, when it's when the level of enthusiasm needed to get everyone involved, whatever gender or whatever background, drops low enough, then you hit the second age. But the thing for the first age that I always remember is when I try to explain this to relatives or friends, the phrase I'd hear that still haunts me? I'd say role-playing, and they say, is it like a sexual thing?
Ew!
Because that's what the word meant in the 80s. Role-playing meant you dress up as Superman and your girlfriend dresses up as Lois Lane. Or you dress up as Lois Lane and your girlfriend dresses up as Superman. Yeah, so that was the thing, because it was so arcane, nobody knew. And the second age, the phrase was, I don't want to be Elfstar anymore, I want to be Debbie.
I still don't understand what that means.
Right, so, as you know, but I suspect find it hard to believe, there was a genuine and passionate body of opinion, especially in the United States in the 80s, that D&D was the gateway to Satanism.
I mean, what wasn't the gateway to Satanism in the 1980s in America? I mean, really, it was, have a tangerine, well, that's how he gets in.
Well, so what usually happens, and I don't want to sound frivolous about this, is that some poor kid kills himself or herself, usually himself, 4 to 1 chance of that, and then their parents lose their fucking minds because your kid killing yourself is the worst thing that can happen to you.
Yeah.
And
therapeutically confirmed.
Yeah. Some poor woman lost her son and bothered about Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Abandoned it. And this was sort of the nexus for lots of concerned people wanting to burn D&D books in the same way that the record industry dealt with people wanting to burn records. I mean, I think probably, honestly, both the record industry and TSR, who made D&D, were quite glad of it, because if somebody burns a record, you can sell another copy of it, and you get the notoriety on the rest of it. But certainly, it made life difficult for those of us who had concerned relatives, even in the UK.
Did you get some? Did you get people saying, "Are you sure you want to play it?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And then by the time I got to university, the Christian Union was still sort of significant at university in a way that I don't think it is anymore. And also, genuinely, having said this, there was a big overlap between role players and occultists in my circle of friends. There's the two worlds literally collided on one occasion when a portly friend of mine, who told the story very entertainingly afterwards, went round to the house of the guy who used to GM Shadowrun, and he sat on a weak chair, collapsed backward through the plasterboard wall that separated the Shadowrun GM's living room from the Shadowrun GM's Kabbalist temple, with the carpet roll pillars of knowledge and the altar on wheels.
Carpet roll pillars of knowledge.
And the gold and silver painted footballs at the top of the pillars.
They weren't footballs.
Well, how was he going to find a cheap sphere in Bangor in the 1990s? And so this thing happened, and it, the veil of the temple was rent in twain, and the hangings came off the walls, and the temple collapsed, and the
so it was like Amdram Jesus in the temple.
Yeah, and then one of the footballs went. I wasn't there, but the gentleman in question, Nigel, tells the story. The football, total silence, and then in classic post-car crash.
Just slow, like
boom, 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 boom. So a lot of genuine overlap, but to my knowledge, nobody ever actually, killed themselves or attempted to summon anything from. But that was so. Jack Chick notoriously was a tract author. He wrote a lot of Christian tracts. A lot of them were about how terrible Catholics are and how they were secretly Satanists. Some of them, I think, were about sort of the gays and how they were going to turn your children into the gays.
Oh, God.
And then there's one spectacular classic about the dangers of D&D, where Debbie is playing D&D with her teacher, because obviously teachers all play D&D with their pupils all the time. Yeah. And Debbie's friend Blackleaf dies from a poison trap, but Debbie is unfazed by this, so her teacher tells her that she's ready to be initiated into the craft, and she says, I'm going to teach you the real magic now because your clerics reach 8th level. And then Debbie goes home, and she uses the mind bondage spell to make her father buy her $200 worth of D&D books and figures.
Right.
And
that's how I got mine.
But then she goes around to visit her friend whose thief Blackleaf died, and her friend has hung herself. And this makes Debbie rethink her priorities, and she goes back to Miss vaguely Dom Energy English teacher, whatever her name is, and says, I don't want to be Debbie at Elfstar anymore. I want to be Debbie.
Oh my God. I mean, I really don't know where to start with that.
It's the whole thing is in a tone of absolute seriousness. So look for Jack Chick D&D.
I'm not going to.
Online. Well, listeners, please do. And then it all gets very serious, and Debbie burns her D&D manuals and received into the arms of the Lord and exercised and all the rest of it. But imagine that being published today.
It's funny that when you tell the story about the sort of disastrous football temple, which is what it's now known as, because one of the things that we're talking about, the effect D&D has had on the modern landscape of nerdery and gaming, which is both video game and tabletop gaming. And one of the things that I complain about frequently about all of this is what we describe as a lack of ambition sometimes. So one of the things I've noticed about TRPG stuff particularly is that people seem to be accepting of things that I think still look quite old. So, for example, if you look at character sheets, they'll often have sort of typography and layouts that don't look modern, and that's fine. They're very functional and they're great, and they give you enough flavour, and then you move on. But I'm a graphic designer and I'm a millennial, so I think I expect a bit more kind of modernity, a bit more beauty in the stuff that I would normally buy. And when I go to the TRPG side of things, I get the sense that's not really a priority for lots of people, which is fine because no one has to care about this. But I think some people do, and I think it would be interesting to kind of see what we can do to make it more beautiful and more kind of enjoyable as a kind of premium product, which is why we are working on a kind of boxed edition with our stuff to see if that is an appetite. Or maybe I'll be totally wrong, and in a year's time I'll be doing a podcast and saying, no one gave a hoot. That was a terrible idea. But this is also something that I've seen in the kind of wargaming side. So I'm not a war gamer. I've never super been into the models, though I did like the kind of artistic painting of them. Though it turns out that's really hard to do. Don't underestimate it. And there was a particular modern sort of, I don't know if it's called a wargaming, I don't know what it would call. It calls itself like a tabletop skirmisher. It's called Malifaux, published by Wyrd Games, if anyone is interested. And they, I think, are the absolute market leaders in like beautiful models. Whereas my ex-partner used to play a lot of like Warhammer, and as I think anybody who's ever seen a Warhammer model knows, they're these sort of tiny, quite ugly, sort of like very stylized dwarf people who have lots of shoulder pads, and then they're sort of nuns with their boobs out.
I think you might have lost some listeners describing this in this way, although I think it's entirely unfair. But
this is the thing again. So it's a mood, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a particular mood, and I think
I remember trying to explain the Warhammer 40,000 cosmology to you, and you were not impressed.
No, anyway, look, the point is, I'm not saying that, one thing is bad, another thing is good, but I am saying that I have seen a consistent aesthetic in tabletop, particularly, for decades, and I think that's quite unusual.
That's a good point.
And you don't see that in games. I know you get a lot of stuff that is particularly put out there as a retro thing, so pixel art is still very, very popular, even though by now, obviously, we can make, think of any Ubisoft game, and it's just incredibly beautiful 3D stuff, but people still like the kind of nostalgia. So again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying the Warhammer models are bad, but I am saying that they are a particular style that people seem to go back to, which is not what I would expect from an industry that is blossoming. It's getting more mainstream. They're getting more people. They're getting more women. They're getting everybody is getting more excited about this stuff. But I'm surprised that people are still kind of content with the football on a stick in some ways. And I wonder if that is going to change, or if I'm fundamentally missing something about the reason that lots of people play this stuff.
I think
so. That's what I meant.
I think
take back sees anything that insults anyone listening to this.
I think tradition is important. And I think if you are interested in toy soldiers, and I use the term without malice,
the little green ones.
Just generally games with toy soldiers go all the way back to H.G. Wells developing the first ever sort of set of coherent wargame rules. It's not entirely true. There's a Kriegspiel thing in nerdery. Okay, H.G. Wells was an early wargamer and invented some early wargames rules. But if you are interested in moving figures around that are going to be shooting each other or hitting each other with melee weapons, then that pushes you in a particular aesthetic direction, right? Not many of them are going to be wearing ball gowns or sitting at chess tables. It's just not the point of it. So it does. Battlefields look a particular way. And I was watching Troll Hunters with my kid yesterday, and interestingly, because obviously I went off and Googled bits because it's interesting and I'm a nerd, and one of the art director was talking about the hero, and the hero has this amulet that when he uses it suddenly clothes him in shining armour. And he said the reason that we wanted the armour as a physical manifestation of his abilities is because he's meant to look like a gawky teenager with skinny legs. And we needed him to have the silhouette of a hero. So when he puts on this plate armour, suddenly he's got the big shoulders. And the big shoulders do speak to something. So I don't know. I think that's part of it. But I think you're right. I think it's also tradition and authority. And the fact that this thing has been that way, and that somebody who has some sort of aura or authority has said something like that is relevant.
And it's incredibly powerful, right? I mean, one of the big takeaways from the essay that you mentioned at the whole start of this podcast, the one where we talk about hit points, is that I can't tell you how many RPGs I have played in 2021 which still use hit points as a system, and now part of that is because it's a really effective, simple way of explaining a mechanic in a game that everybody understands. But also, as you already to point out, there's many other ways in which you could do that, But often we kind of don't examine it. We just assume that hit points are part of how this system works because they were introduced in role-playing circles, and we kind of built on it from there. So again, I'm not critiquing that, but I think it's fascinating that system and many systems in TRPGs have stayed the same and have been so influential in so many other kinds of game
It
design.
is very, and the idea of leveling up, which I heard Boris Johnson. Everyone's heard Boris Johnson. God help us. Use the phrase
leveling up. I never thought I'd be talking about TRPG and then have to think about Boris Johnson.
Leveling up in a speech. He wants to level up the
British economy.
Yeah. And I suspect he's not aware of it. He doesn't need to be aware of where that phrase came from. But I think it can only be ultimately from D&D. That's it's spread into the mainstream.
It doesn't really mean anything else. I can't think of another kind of leveling up.
Yeah.
You think of promotion in jobs, you think of growing up, but leveling up is very specific.
And you see discussion of it like the FT and the Guardian, and nobody else goes back to the etymology of it. And why would you? We talk about wool gathering, we don't talk about the etymology of it.
Yeah.
But it has spread. And the reason it spread is because it's a really effective, simple mechanic. There are problems with systems based on levels rather than skills or traits or whatever. But it just works, and you get the sort of narrative moment of in World of Warcraft, it's called the ding. When you, probably in other MMOs, when you get the sort of shaft of golden light and sound when you level up. Yeah.
Well, I play a little game with the UI designers at that point. I leave it for quite a long time before I choose a new skill point, and you get these messages of increasing desperation being like, use your skill point! It'll be great!
But other things, some things came in by chance. Some things came in by chance and had a good reason for them. I mean, for example, clerics using blunt weapons. As far as I can tell, that dates back to this sort of cynical idea in the Northumberland in the 15th century or something, where one particular bishop, who was also a noble, was told there was a prescription against shedding blood if you're a clergyman, so he rode to battle with a mace rather than a sword, because he shed less blood. And so this ends up centuries later as a tenet
established
of D&D.
Character trait.
And it sort of drifts away over time now in like 5th edition D&D. You can get clerics use edge weapons and all the rest of it. But it's still a sort of assumption you see a lot of games. It's not particularly meaningful, but it started in our DNA, so it ended in our DNA. And then some stuff gets squeezed out. So the reason that D&D original flavour, and I guess still current flavour, has wizards memorising spells, and you need to decide which spells to memorise, you get one use of each, is because Gary Gygax happened to be a fan of Jack Vance, who happened to pick that mechanic in his earlier sequence of books. And I don't think it's a particularly compelling idea, and I think it's quite a bad system, and nearly every game has gone away to some sort of magic point based or cooldown based things, including D&D, which has at least 2 other forms of spellcasting that don't rely on that. But it ended up in the DNA at the beginning, so it still has some longevity, but other places have tended to move away from it. And the thing is, I can't emphasise this enough, sorry to spoil the mystique, folks, but I've been making games professionally for well over a decade now, and semi-professionally for God knows how long before then. And most rules in most games, especially TRPGs, which are often written very fast and have a lot of bulking material, just made up and written down. Some have been play tested, the important ones have been play tested, but who play tested encumbrance system? Again, I'm sure there are people, but it's got this sense of authority. And I had this quite epiphanic experience towards the end of my time at university, when I was putting together a system for what was ultimately a play-by-mail game. We should talk about play-by-mail games in another episode because they're long dead, called Compass Rose, where people are all
I still love that name.
Thank you. Where the rose which encompasseth all. And so players were wizards. It was sort of an Ars Magica vibe, if you know that, where people were spending their time in their towers learning stuff rather than necessarily going out and fighting. And it anticipated cultist in a lot of ways, I guess. And I wrote out a sheet which was sort of a list, or a rules book, which was a list of like places you could live and the amount of space they had and the amount of money it took to buy them. So there was like a cottage and a cave and a church and a tower, and a paragraph description of each. And I typed it up on it wasn't even a PC, it was some sort of pre-PC device in the corner of my living room, and I printed it out with the borrowed printer. And then a friend of mine came over to look at what I was doing, and he picked up the sheet and he went, "Ooh, rules." And he read down it, and he put the page down and he said, "Yeah, I think I'm going to aim for a tower." Very seriously, like this was a list of possible places for wizards to live that had been found in a tomb in Sumeria. And I just had this epiphanic moment of realising I just made this up. And then, because it's been written down on a piece of paper and has a heading and looks serious, this bloke who I've known for years and who knows I'm just some schmuck has taken it seriously. And there is something where the moment you write it down and give it a heading and some numbers, people take it seriously in a whole different way. Which is part of the fun of it. I mean, it's enjoyable to have that sense of authority and significance when you're playing a game, rather than just the wishy-washiness of, I don't know, is that a good roll, is that a bad roll? So
I think it's something more profound than that as well, though, because going back to what we were talking about earlier with if you want someone to engage with something basic, tell them to click this button. Don't make it complicated. If you say to somebody, where would you like to live as a wizard? A lot of people will sort of blank and think, I don't know, maybe I want to live in Scarborough, maybe I want to live in a little hobbit hole. I don't know. And what are they going to say? Maybe it'll be better than my idea, and I'll feel like an idiot. Whereas if you say one of three options, which one do you want? Everybody can immediately engage on the same level, and I think that's really attractive.
That's a good point, and it reconfigures my thinking about it a bit.
I mean, I'm sure you're right as well.
No, I think you're right, and you're always talking about games as personality tests.
Well, so one of the things that we've been experimenting, I think, has been received very well by reception I've seen so far.
Let's do a plug.
So we're making a TRPG version of Cultist Simulator set in 1920s Alexandria in Egypt, and I am coming to this and trying, naively and stupidly probably, to try and shake up some of the stuff that I have experienced in TRPGs. So one of the things that I've already discovered was a terrible idea is I set out initially to make this as sort of streamlined as possible. I wanted to create a physical box full of pretty items that were attractive in their own right, that I could take to any one of my non-nerd friends and say, play this with me, and they immediately be able to kind of sit down without a background in TRPGs and what to expect in polyhedral dice and have a good evening. And I think that's a good idea, but one of the things I was like, right, what I don't want is a really complicated booklet that someone has to sit down beforehand and read. And absolutely, you need a complicated booklet that somebody sits down and reads before anyone can play it, and that is just part of the pain.
Because otherwise you've got a piece of paper that says, this game is set in Alexandria. Now make up the rest.
Exactly. It's now draw the rest of the owl. Okay. Yeah. So I'm still trying to streamline it, but I immediately understood. Having just briefly engaged with this, why that is the way it is, and I can make it as short as I possibly can, and I can not include encumbrance rules and say, basically take this one for the team and just kind of let the story flow. But you do need actually quite a lot of upfront understanding of a system before you can kind of seamlessly run a game for your mates. So that's, I think, a good example. And I've totally forgotten where we came in on this. Plugging it.
The back of the character sheets.
The back of the character, yeah. So we're talking about how if you present people with an option or several options, rather than just saying, so tell me about your character, and people have to make something out of nothing, that's quite stressful. So we've been experimenting on our character sheets by having a bunch of the stuff you might expect, a number of stats, a number of characteristical traits. Characteristical, that's what we're going with. It's written in bad English. And on the back, there's a personality quiz, which I hope people will annotate if they can think of a particular personality answer that they want to give. But also give you a bunch of, I think there's 3 to 5 options on each question. So it'll be things like, what's your background, or what did your sister do when she was 5, and why are you terrified of antelope, and all this kind of stuff, to give kind of prompt people in different directions whilst not putting too much burden on them to be immediately creative and impressive. Because there are some people out there who are brilliant at this sort of stuff and will say really funny things. There are other people who are brilliant but a bit nervous or a bit shy. There are people out there who are just not particularly good at coming up on the spot with things, and you want to give them options that make them feel that they can join in as quickly and easily as everyone else. And people have seemed to really like that, because 1, people love talking about themselves, 2, it's funny, and 3, as soon as you've done a personality quiz, you basically want to turn to somebody who will listen to you and say, look, I chose this, and then my spirit animal is a chameleon, and everyone goes, I think that's the thing. I think
I'll tell the story another time of Mortal Coils, the ill-fated RPG that I was involved in making. It was actually the brainchild of the same guy who destroyed the temple back
what a legacy.
in Bangor in the 1980s. And one of the big problems with that is that ran into the issue of wanting to tell everybody, make your own entertainment and let your creativity fly free. And then we sort of realised halfway through it that actually people like to be given prompts.
Yeah.
And even improv, you put a couple of performers on stage and say, do it improv. They'll say, what now? And you give them some prompts. They'll now
this is basically why charades is the game that everyone plays at Christmas, because anybody who is able to read can get up and read a title, and then some people are bad at impersonating the title, and some people are brilliant at it, but everyone kind of knows where to start. Whereas if you say to somebody, right, Janine, get up and impersonate some sort of media that we will guess, Janine's going to go, what? I don't know, I need some time to think about it. And prompts are great.
Well, I was going to say two things about the quiz sheets, the questionnaires at the back of the character sheets. One is that early on, you remember, you kept saying, well, I don't want to straitjacket people, and I should put a note in saying if you can think of better ideas. And I kept saying, don't be a fucking wuss. If people want to cross out the question and write the answer on, they can, and they will, and they should. And people do this stuff all the time. People write marginalia in books, the monsters. And
I like that. I'm pro marginalia in books.
Well, it depends on the book. But the but if you put something every fifth sentence saying, of course, this is all just our guidelines. It's more a guideline than a rule. Then
I should channel Barbosa more.
You don't come across as necessarily as flexible.
You come across as lacking faith in your own system.
Exactly. Yeah, people have bought the system because they want the system. They haven't bought the system to be told make up your own system.
And that's why I've fundamentally come round to this belief that we do need some sort of actually quite extensive booklet up front. Yeah. And unfortunately, that's just the way that this system works. It's like, I can't make a sandwich without having any sort of bread or filling. You just need certain components for this to work. And if I don't want to do that, then I shouldn't be making a role-playing tabletop game.
And I think that's the thing is if you're going to make something, make something. As an old acquaintance of mine told me long ago, never deprecate yourself because other people do that for you. But the last thing I wanted to say is just that because I've got something of a rep when people think about Weather Factory and think about writing, they tend to think about me. But folks, Lottie Bevan is a genuinely fine writer. And I wet myself reading some
fine.
of the...
Americans are going to read that and be like, she thinks...
Lottie Bevan is a thoughtful, articulate...
No, it's fine. Now I'm British and embarrassed, don't.
Yeah, eloquent writer.
But I'm quite funny.
And very funny. And the questionnaires, you read them, and first of all, they're very entertaining. And secondly, they do immediately evoke a particular mood and time and place and set of possibilities.
I have done my research.
Yeah.
Right, well, okay, so we have said TRPGs are great. TRPGs are originally quite for nerds and now less so for nerds. TRPGs have a lot of staying power and a lot of tradition, which speaks to the power of whatever is inside of them. But you should also buy the new one, which is The Lady Afterwards that we're making. And we have gone on way longer than I expected, so I think we need to do more on this because obviously we care.
Well, there's a whole... I might screenshot my notes and put them on the old Twitters afterwards, just so people see all the things we didn't talk about. But I do want to talk about where they're going.
Yeah, we should do a follow-up to we've talked about the past and now we'll talk about the future.
Get my kid on to talk about Dream SMP.
Oh yeah, we said we can do that. Okay, cool. Right, well, that's it from us today. More on D&D and tabletops and their legacy next time.
Have a spooky day.